Professor Banerjee, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here. My first question is, what are some common misconceptions or myths about poverty? And how do these misconceptions impact governmental policies addressing the poverty?
So I think one of the myths that I think is probably very influential is this idea that poor people cannot necessarily be trusted with getting help, because if you help them, they're going to become lazy, they'll get used to it, they're going to start using the money for whatever, doing things that are not good for their families, drinking or something. So there's a very, that particular theory is very influential, and has been influential forever. It's not just now, it's been forever. People have this suspicion of the poor. And it comes out of this idea that why would they be poor if they were not somehow defective in some ways? And so I think from that, they have this idea that, in fact, if you give people easy access to help, they're going to become, they're going to actually react in ways that are not even in their own interests, maybe. And I think there's no evidence for that, and there's lots of evidence against that. I think there's strong evidence that if you give, in fact, if anything, poor people often are depressed and a bit hopeless because they don't have, possibilities in their life. And as a result, they often, when they get some, unexpected benefit, they actually react positively. They try to do something with that money. They try to start a business or invest in their children or try to improve their lives. There's no evidence that they, start, abusing the money, and no evidence whatsoever that they stop working. So that's important because, of course, that simplifies the business of how you help the poor. If you have to make them, jump through a number of hoops to earn the money, then you have to then have the whole apparatus for doing that. If it's just a matter of giving them money, it's much easier. So in that sense, there is a small, there's a encouraging piece to this evidence, which is that they can be trusted. They won't do awful things with the money. They won't stop working. They're just going to be happier and more productive.
Okay, let me ask you this. What is your opinion on aid programs targeting the poorest countries, such as those carried out by the United Nations, for example?
I think that aid programs, I think the first order factor on most aid programs, unless you're a very small country, aid programs are very small. I mean, they're just not very, they help poorest countries, but very much at the margin at best. It's not that they are a lot of money. If you think of what countries do for their own citizens, a huge proportion of that comes from the country itself. And that's true in Kazakhstan as well. That if there is a substantial, it's a big country. In these kinds of countries, there is just no way that the aid is going to be very important for the actual funding of programs. So what often aid does usefully, and in cases it's not always used usefully, but when it is, what it can do is it can be an instrument for a particular a particular objective. It can target a particular objective and make that happen. So, for example, sometimes what aid has done in Africa, for example, the availability of cheaper AIDS drugs through PEPFAR has been, and that was a very good example of aid. It's very targeted. It's about one thing, about making antiretrovirals available to people who would not otherwise get it. And when you do that, then you can often bring a large benefit because it can be very much targeted on one thing, and you can get something that maybe governments have many complicated objectives, and you can just say, okay, but whatever it is, let's save these lives, and then you can do it. That's one thing you can do with aid, which is very often effective. The other thing that I think aid has often been useful in is just doing something an experiment, to do something that wouldn't happen otherwise. Because governments are often either scared to experiment or they are reluctant to experiment because what happens if they fail, or they are just too busy to experiment. So sometimes it's nice to, in some ways, have an opportunity to do something that maybe this is not what we're doing, but let's try it, and if it works, it's going to be great. So often, what aid can do effectively is fund experiments and take us out of the standard. This is how we do things. What it can do is it can take us out of that frame. It can say, okay, well, there's this other thing we could do, and maybe it'll work.
Could you please explain the concept of the poverty trap? Why is it so challenging for individuals to break free from the poverty?
Well, I mean, if you think about most poor people, the challenges they face, relative to people who are richer than them, they have less access to finance. Banks don't really want to deal with poor people, so they have less access to finance. They are closer to the margin of starvation, so taking risk is more costly for them. Because if you take a risk and you fail, for somebody middle class, maybe they still have something to fall back on, and for very poor people, that's not true. So it puts them in a place which is really dire. They have less effective social networks. Typically, if you are from a affluent family, you have other connections with affluent families. So if you want to go into business, you know someone. Most poor people don't know anyone who's kind of successful in business. They live in places which are less accessible to. So if you want to start a shop, it has to be not next to your home, because next to your home other poor people live. You want to start a successful shop, you want to start it far away from your home, so you have to travel. You don't have much education, so it's helping your children with their education is harder, and so on. I can keep going, but the point is that if you think about it, it's obvious that poor people, just to do the same things that somebody else would do, just have a harder problem. They have a much harder problem to solve. If somebody wants to start a business and they have access to a bank loan, they have a family who can help them, then it's easier. And if you don't have any of those things, then you're always fighting a number of battles that somebody else wouldn't have to fight. And in that sense, what the idea of poverty trap is simply that, which is that it's harder for poor people to do the same things as the rest of us do.
Drawing from your research across different nations, which anti-poverty methods do you consider the least effective?
I think that's a hard question to answer, because I think it's not so much that it's a matter of. I think the general point is that when you have the wrong diagnosis, or you start from ideological diagnoses, then you end up with outcomes that are often not what you want. And sometimes you don't even find out because you don't collect the data. But I think the general point is that ideology often makes programs work badly. And that's partly just, I know what the right thing to do. I do it. So lots of people have that kind of attitude. They overvalue their experts' knowledge, their expertise. They say that this is what we should do, and that is, we should invest in education and not in something else. That's one problem. The other problem is that even within education, people have very strong views on how to do we have to give people computers. For example, that's an example of something that you hear often. It's often a priority for governments, and there's almost no evidence that computers by themselves help children learn. So that's a good combination of something. So I don't want to go into the list of all the things that have failed. That's in a sense depressing and not helpful. I think the diagnosis is important, that people we get there to these such places because there are really not many. There's not enough experimentation. There's not enough evidence-based decision making.
The official statement for your Nobel Prize win is for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. As I prepared for this interview, I noticed that many economists described your approach as akin to introducing a medical approach into economics. Could you please explain the essence of the method that you proposed to our viewers?
So I think what is akin to medical is the idea that you should do an experiment, that you don't know whether the theory might be plausible, but it doesn't mean that it works. So that's the view that you should design a program, and that the design of the program should be you should come out of a priori principles rather than out of trying things and seeing if they work. That's at the heart of the idea is you should try them. Now, experiments in medicine often are small. They are very controlled. You have 60 people who get the medicine and 60 people who get a placebo. We often have experiments which have 6 million people who get the treatment or who might get the treatment and 6 million people who might not. So they're really very different kinds of experiments. But the idea that you want to have some very clear commitment to having a control group that's not chosen to sort of by the experimenter. The experimenter should have limited control over the choice of the control group, because if he doesn't, then I think the results are rarely credible, because people say that, look, yes, you gave these to the rich children. The rich children, in any case, didn't need them. They would have done better in any case. So it's important to have a clear commitment to not make the experiment, design the experiment so that it always works. And that's the basic idea from medicine, that, for example, they randomly choose people, and we often do that for that reason, to tie our hands, to not be able to influence who gets the medicine and who doesn't. Because if you can influence them, then the outcome might be biased.
Talking about the government initiatives and national strategies aimed at improving the well-being of the population, in your view, what should be the ideal collaboration between the government and the scientific community in order to, for example, to use the approach that you proposed?
I think that the ideal, and sometimes we get that, is when the government has a clear idea of what it wants to know and comes and says, can you help us with the evidence? What do you know already? What can you learn by doing extra experiments? So before a policy is made, if the government is willing to ask questions, and sometimes the government has compulsions to act fast, but we can still tell them that, look, this has been tried in 6 countries and has never worked. And that one has worked in some other countries. So I think we were sort of we both do experiments, but also we can summarize what has been learned from past experiments and past efforts. So we're a resource for government. So I think it's more when governments want to design policies, I think the ideal is when they make use of the resource, and sometimes that means doing new experiments, sometimes it means using the results from old experiments, but it's thinking of it as being one thing you will do before you go ahead with the policy.
In which countries the method that you suggested are already being used, and what results have they led to?
I think there are 2 separate questions there. One is how many countries do we have studies of government or other social programs using these methods? And the answer is, I think 80-something countries have them. The other question is, where is the government now much more directly engaged with using the results from it, which is a smaller number, but still countries in Europe, for example, in the US, a lot of local governments use these results quite extensively. In the UK, France, Spain, these are Italy to a lesser extent, but to some extent. And then in Asia, I think there's some of evidence that's being used in China, in parts of India, parts of Bangladesh. Indonesia is a big kind of site for these kinds of things. Philippines, then Peru and Chile and Brazil are places where, and Mexico have all been places where experimental evidence have played an important role in policy. And then South Africa, Kenya, there's lots of countries, but I mean, not 80, but probably 20 countries.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few several questions. They are all related to Kazakhstan. So last year, during one of the meetings, President of Kazakhstan noted that the sluggish pace of economic growth over the past 10 years has led our country, Kazakhstan, to become stuck in the middle income trap. Could you please explain what the middle income trap is and, in your opinion, how can a country escape it?
It's not clear that there is a middle income trap. Let me be so it's not. I mean, I think countries. The fact that growth slows down, we don't actually know whether it's because it's in middle income or because it's just there's all kinds of global factors. You know, the prices of things change. There's a pandemic. There is a, you know, in 2008, 9, there was a great recession. There's just so many things. So I think that it's I think first order, I'm not sure I necessarily buy the diagnosis that there is something that's particularly specific about middle income, because some countries have continued to grow, and I think that if you think of, for example, China, take an example where this growth has slowed. I mean, China is a huge demographic challenge. It's a country where population has been, you know, the fertility rates are low, the young generations are smaller, and so you know there's a labor supply, potential labor supply challenge. So these are things that are nothing to do with middle income. It has just to do with the other things that are happening in these countries. If you think about, you know, what Korea is dealing with now, it's a demographic challenge. It has nothing to do with income per se. It has to do with the fact that people, for whatever reason, people don't want to have babies. You can think of, but other countries are dealing with climate disasters, and that's going to slow them down. So I don't necessarily accept, but I'm not saying that there couldn't be a middle income trap. I'm just saying that there isn't. I wouldn't take it as given that there's a middle income trap, rather than there's a combination of maybe policies that could work better and bad luck. I think it's often that's going to be enough to slow down growth. I wish I knew more about Kazakhstan. I hope to know more about Kazakhstan, but I mean, that's about all I can really say.
Last year, the number of poor people in Kazakhstan reached a record high, surpassing 1.1 million individuals, while the total population of Kazakhstan is 20 million. That's according to the Bureau of National Statistics of Kazakhstan. As a scientist who understands the nature of the poverty, the question is simple, actually. What recommendations could you give to our government to reduce the number of poor people in Kazakhstan?
You know, if I had to pick one thing, I would say that there is now reassuring evidence that, you know, providing some income transfers to the poor works. It makes them richer without creating, I said at the beginning of this interview, that without creating any perverse effects. So if I had to suggest one thing, either an income transfer, an asset transfer, there's a whole literature on whether it should be income or assets, and there are arguments on both sides. And given time, I could say all those things. But I think this is relatively simple in the sense that it doesn't require, designing a whole infrastructure to, for example, to, improving schools or improving healthcare. These things are long-term infrastructural investments, and whereas making transfers is relatively straightforward.
Professor Banerjee, thank you very much for the interview. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.